My name is Angelina Avedano, and this is InterSpace, where we explore the spaces between us. Join me for discussions on a series of realities with thinkers, writers, thought leaders, and artists. Dr. Elana Jefferson-Tatum is a hypnobirthing coach, full-spectrum doula, and practitioner scholar of Africana religions. After several years in the academy teaching at Hobart and William Smith Colleges and then Tufts University, she shifted her life entirely. Now she's a proud homeschooling parent and the owner of LunarFlow Doula. Welcome, Elana. Hi, Elana. Welcome to InterSpace. I am so excited about this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, you are welcoming your third child into your family. Congratulations. And what is so interesting is that welcoming your new baby dovetails nicely with your introducing your incredible work with LunarFlow Doula. Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah. So first, thank you. I'm really excited to be having my third child, which will probably be my last. So it's kind of like this, it's exciting. And it's also, there's an extra amount of like really needing to appreciate this time. Um, and I think it also, like you said, it coincides well with me kind of introducing the work that I do. So LunarFlow Doula came out of my own experiences as a birthing person. When I had my first child, I had a pretty traumatic experience in the hospital that involved obstetric violence and specifically assault. So I had a nurse come in who I had never seen this nurse. I didn't know what her name was. And she came in, quote unquote, to check my cervix. Didn't ask, didn't introduce herself, and came in while I was like really in the throes of labor, already just like, I don't know what's going on. This is my first labor experience. Put her hands in my vagina and took them out and then like left, or I don't know what even happened to her because I was really upset by that point. And so that was a really traumatic experience. And, I was able to, get through the labor and have a vaginal birth and birth my first child, but that trauma really stayed with me. And so then my second birth, I was like, at least I'm somewhat aware of what I don't know at this point, right? And so for my second birth, I said, I really want to feel more confident. I want to feel more empowered. I want to feel more in control of my birthing experience and my body in the birthing experience. And so I began to do some research. And I found out about doulas and hired a doula. Fabulous doula, a Latina woman who really helped me to create a really sacred space in my birthing space. But I also found hypnobirthing. And at the time, the school that I really liked the most was the Calm Birth School, which is out of the UK. And they didn't have any US instructors at the time, specifically instructors of color. And so I decided to do their sort of video. They had like a little mini video course, and I sort of did that. And it really, even though I didn't have the one-on-one engagement I would have liked, it really kind of helped me to build my confidence to work through some of my anxieties and fears so that I could birth. So my second experience, I was in the hospital again, but I had the support again of my partner and then a doula. And the nice thing about the doula is the doula became like this sort of, I feel like her most important role was kind of as this kind of wall between my husband and I and the hospital. Right. So that there was some space and we didn't feel over bombarded by this, medical industrial complex, right. In my birthing environment, which should be sacred. And she helped me to set up a beautiful altar she had set up all these beautiful figurines of goddesses and women birthing from different traditions. And so it really kind of helped me to really get in touch with where I was in my birthing process. And then from hypnobirthing, I had gained this sort of confidence and was using my breathing techniques, right? And so by the time it came time to birth my son, I prayed like I had never prayed before. It was funny because I had labored all day long the day before and all through the night. And I was like, okay, it's time to get an epidural. I'm exhausted. I've been laboring for hours and hours and hours. So I got an epidural to rest. And so then it was early in the morning. It was probably like 5:30 in the morning because he was born around 6:30, right? I woke up, everyone else was asleep, and I was like, y'all, it's time. And I just started praying. Like the ancestors were just speaking through me. I was calling my Vodun. I'm in the Vodun tradition. So I was calling my deities. I was calling the names of my ancestors. And I was just praying and praying and praying and invoking them in that space, right? And in this moment of transition, right? What we call this sort of in-between worlds, right? When the baby is, still in the womb and yet about to enter this new world, this sort of in-between space. And I was just praying and praying, praying. And then right after that, I was like, okay, y'all. And it was funny because everyone was kind of standing to the back, like they knew it was time, but no one bothered me. And so everyone came up, and then I birthed my son, and everything, with this one, everything went smoothly, breastfeeding and everything. And so I was like, okay, this was a really different experience, and this is something. It really changed me. And at this point, I was a professor. My life was completely different. And, thought this was what my life was still going to be. Time went on. And one of the things I realized was like having this birthing experience changed me, right? I wasn't just giving birth to my child. I was giving birth to a new iteration of myself, a new me, right? And so a little while after I gave birth, I decided, this wasn't for me anymore. Being a professor wasn't for me anymore. And so I left. My husband and I obviously had lots of conversations about that, and I left, and I eventually founded LunarFlow Doula. And the idea of LunarFlow Doula is really to help birthing people to connect with their natural cycles, to connect with the natural rhythms of their body and the power that's already inherent with them, and to build that confidence. And so I do a lot of doula coaching, but I think a lot of what I've been focusing on lately has been around hypnobirthing, because it is so powerful in terms of helping birthing people to build that inner strength and confidence that's already there, right? Our ancestors have been birthing for generations. It's already there, right? So we're just tapping into, I'm not giving them anything, right? We're just tapping into the strength and the knowledge that's already there.
What I love, Elana, is that this is where our work intersects. You describe hypnobirthing on your website as a process and a learning to flow with rather than against, which is essential to a positive experience with birth. And this is exactly the same as the creative process and the work that I am doing.
Yeah, so much so. It's funny because the more that I research and understand how birth is done in the US and the UK and all these other, Western cultures, it's so important to tap into that power to flow with versus against, right? It's funny because as a scholar, for years I've been studying. So my scholarly background, I'm a scholar of Africana religions, I've always specifically been interested in materiality, right? And some of my questions have been around, like, why has religion in so many major ways kind of jettisoned materiality as other than, right? This sort of dichotomy between the spiritual and the material, right? Which from how I've understand Africana traditions doesn't make any sense. And most indigenous traditions doesn't make any sense. There's no spirituality without materiality, right? That these practices are fully embodied, fully material, fully involving nature. Like, how do you have nature that is sacred and yet the sacred or the spiritual is seen as separate then, right? And I think what I'm starting to realize is it relates so much to the birthing experience as well, right? That, in the Enlightenment, right, there's this understanding of nature as other than, as something that needs to be a commodity, that's something that needs to be controlled. And the same thing is what happened to birthing people's bodies, right? These bodies need to be controlled, contained, measured, right? They can't operate on their own, right? You can't just tap into your intuition in birth, right? And so it's just interesting how I'm finding this sort of synergy between the theoretical and historical work I've been doing as an academic and this sort of practical work I'm now doing as a doula and a hypnobirthing coach.
Could you talk a little more about this transition from academia to your calling as a doula? This is such a profound transformation. I mean, after investing so much of your identity into your academic life and working so hard to realize your goals only to find this path was not for you, there must have been an incredible amount of grief wrapped up in letting go of those dreams, even if they were dreams you weren't fully sure why you were working endlessly to pursue.
Yeah. Oh, this has really been a process of refining myself in so many ways. So, it really goes back to undergrad. When I entered undergrad, right, I grew up as an only child to a Black single mother um, who was not a single mother by choice, and who struggled, right? We struggled quite a bit. The one thing I will say about that struggle is I always appreciated seeing my mom work so hard, right? I actually, at the age of 10, got to see my mom graduate from college, right? It's not something everyone gets to see. So I really saw her struggle. Um, and so I went into college knowing I wanted to do something great and really kind of continue that process of being, make of her journey, right? And also wanted to make her proud. Um, and but I had no clue what I wanted to do, right? By the time I got pretty older, I was doing pretty good at school, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I entered college, and I think my sophomore year, I saw these classes on like Africana religion and womanist theology, and I was like, ooh, these are interesting, right? I was just like, oh, I'm just fascinated, right? I had always been interested in religion and spirituality and had always had a lot of questions. And so I took 2 classes with a professor, and I was hooked. I was like, oh, I need more of these classes. I just need to just delve into this, right? And I was, good at kind of being a student, right? And so my mentor at the time began to say, oh, you need to, apply for Mellon, and you need to consider a PhD and da 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 da. And I'm like, I don't know where any of this is. Like, I didn't grow up in a world in which, you become a professor, right? Like, that's just not the world I grew up in. So I was just like, at first I was like, no, I don't think I can do that. I just didn't have that kind of self-confidence. And eventually I was like, okay, my mom and this particular mentor really pushed me down this path. And I said, okay. And so I began to kind of go down this path, but what's interesting is I never had a vision of actually becoming a professor, right? I was like, okay, I think I can do this PhD thing, but I'm gonna just do it and use it as an opportunity to keep exploring these topics and like this world that I'm so, fascinated about. For me, it was like, I get to like spend time, exploring, my ancestral traditions. I get to spend time like thinking through questions I'm really like passionate about, where there's space for me to ask questions, right? Growing up in a Black church, and particularly the Baptist church I grew up in, because I also grew up part of the time in an Episcopalian church, but particularly the Baptist church I grew up in, growing up where certain questions weren't, you didn't ask, right? Or you got in trouble for asking certain types of questions, right? And so having an environment where like, ooh, I can just ask questions and explore, I think really was what I needed, and kind of created this space for me to just like figure out who I was, right? And so I decided, okay, I'm gonna do this PhD. But I remember telling my mentor, like, I did not want to be a professor. And I definitely didn't want to be a professor like her, in the sense of just really fully involved in the academy, right? But you go down this path and you're like, oh, I'm just in this space of exploring and learning. And eventually you realize, like, I'm in this thing, and what do I do? Right? So by the time I got to my PhD and I was working on my comps, that was the place where I was like, okay, this is no longer just like exploration. Like, where are we going with this? And so I knew I didn't really want to be a professor, but I was like, okay, now I'm in it. So I guess this is the path I need to take. And so it took me a long time. It took me like 2 years to do my comps because I was really struggling. At the time, I also did an internship at the, what is it called now? I think it's the Women's Health Center in Atlanta, Georgia. No, I think it's called the Feminist Health Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And I did an internship around, it was related to pregnancy. We were looking at kind of there are these little pop-up pregnancy centers that present themselves as actual clinics that are in actuality kind of covers for anti-abortion organizations that get young people to then say, oh, you're not, to convince them not to have an abortion, right? And so we were doing a lot of research and investigation on that in Atlanta area. And so I was doing that while I was kind of studying for my comps. And finally, I just kind of got in a place where I was like, I just have to decide to complete this, wherever this goes. So I finished up my comps and got through my dissertation. And and I originally thought, okay, maybe I'll go the nonprofit route. But by the time I got through that process, I was like, well, it doesn't hurt to try. So what I told myself was, I'm going to try this professor thing. So I applied to jobs. When I was first applying to jobs, I was actually pregnant with my first. Very, very pregnant. So I have memories of going on interviews and traveling with my first. And so I eventually got my first job at Hobart and William Smith colleges and as a postdoctoral fellow, and really loved it. Found that I absolutely loved teaching, like absolutely loved it. Just had a real passion for it. It was a way for me to connect, but also to continue to explore with my students and go through that process in a communal way. And then I ended up getting a tenure track job at Tufts. And I loved it and it was working. But I also started to realize it wasn't me. Like, I was like, okay, I could do this. But one day I sat back, and this was after I had my second child, and I was looking around my apartment, and I was like, this is somebody's life, but it's not mine. It's just not mine. I felt like I was living somebody else's dream. And so I just had to kind of step away. And yes, so that was a process, and it's created. There is mourning there, right? There's been levels of mourning there because that's meant letting go of relationships I'd spent years and years building, right? A whole path I spent years and years building. But I've really found myself in a way that I never found myself when I was younger. I feel like I'm coming into who I really am now in my life, and I'm about to be 38. So it's been a journey.
Well, congratulations on coming into your own. It is such a beautiful journey. You had your first two children in the midst of an incredible time of transition in your life. And now this baby, this pregnancy is going to be an entirely different experience. How are you feeling about that?
It is. I'm noticing that I've created more space to actually enjoy this pregnancy. I think at the beginning of the pregnancy, I was still in that space of like, oh my goodness, my body's going through these changes that I always go through. But as I went further along, I feel like I've had more space to grapple with this pregnancy on a very sort of deep emotional, spiritual level, right? I'm not just like, oh, grinding, but I'm pregnant, right? Where it's like, oh, she's pregnant, but she's still, I really can kind of be present in this moment and realize the spiritual transformation that's going on, right? I think we forget that the body is not just changing, right? You are changing. One thing I have seen from each of my pregnancies is that every pregnancy and birth I've gone through, I have become a slightly different person. It's like I've kind of gone through this sort of up leveling, right? And so there is this period of like, oh my goodness, I'm pregnant, and the nausea and the, oh, I don't like this. But then you also begin to see like, there's this, I don't want to say like, there's this opening that happens, right? Where you begin to embrace. And I feel like I've been able to embrace that earlier. Now that I'm in a space that is so affirming of who I am as a whole, right? And I wasn't there before, right? In terms of being in the academy, I felt very like I had to separate my mind from my body. So even though I'm a scholar of religion and I study religion and spirituality and practice, I felt like I had to neglect my body in a certain kind of way, and also not really, not, it helped, it prevented me from feeling like I could be fully like in touch with what was happening, right? Because if I have to present myself a certain way, right, which neglects my body and what bodily experience I'm going through, if there's no space to really fully articulate that, then spiritually I'm also disconnected, right? So it's been an eye-opening experience.
Elana, could you expand a little more on what it is in the academic lifestyle that requires this kind of separation?
Yeah, there's a performance, right? There's a performance of in the Black community, we talk about the performance of respectability, right? Or that's what's talked about. But there's also a kind of performance of respectability in the academy, right? In terms of presenting yourself a certain way, right? And having to be articulate in a certain kind of way, right? Whereas when you are fully present and be in this sort of pregnancy birthing experience, you are flowing. Sometimes, people talk about how like when you're pregnant, sometimes like, oh, your mind just kind of goes, and I think I think there's something going on there spiritually that's saying you need to pause. We're really uncomfortable with pause and taking breaks, right? And pregnancy and birth will really make you pause, right? And so when you're in an environment that sort of rejects that, like I have to continue to perform when my body and my spirit is saying I need a pause, right? I need rest. Then there is this sort of dissonance that happens, right? And so the experience is one entirely of resistance, because literally you're feeling that resistance on a physical level and an emotional level and a spiritual level, right?
This, I have to say it again, this seems so related to the creative process. When I'm working with individuals creatively, or for instance, with my writing students, we spend a lot of time getting in touch with the individual process and learning to respect and to work with it rather than trying to adopt someone else's process as our own.
Yes, very much so. I mean, if we recall, like birthing is original, one of the original sort of creative acts, right? Like creation is artistry, right? Birth is artistry, right? And so there is this need to flow with, right? When we don't flow with, right, that then our body goes through all of these different traumas, right? So in the birth experience, not flowing with often means sort of interventions, is often caused by interventions either from our environment in terms of our work environment, but it also could be a medical environment where, we're going to make these certain interventions to control, let's say, when you give birth, right? But the same thing can happen with writing, right? With, oh, you have this very clear deadline, right? And maybe my artistry just doesn't flow that way, right? And so it is a very similar process. And so I think that it's a process that requires giving the space and listening. I think we underrate listening because it requires us to step back and say we don't know it all and it's okay.
I want to come back to something you said, which was really beautiful. When you mentioned that not only were you giving birth to a child, but with each birth, you were birthing a new version of yourself. So often we don't take the time to recognize how changed we are as we pass through our process. And we do this again and again, right? It's not just one time. But we just run on to the next thing. We just move through it and don't look back.
Very much so, right? I mean, all of these moments need to be celebrated and acknowledged as moments of transition, right? And moments where we've gone through an initiation, right? Whether you've written a dissertation and completed a dissertation, published a book, had a baby, all of these are experiences of initiation, right? And let's remember, initiation isn't just all like, oh, there's this beautiful ritual. No, there's a trial of fire. So you're going to go through the pain and the suffering, right? And then you come out on the other end, and then and you are slightly different. It's not possible to go through any of these things, to give that much of yourself to anything, right? Whether it's a dissertation you've been writing for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or it's a baby you've been carrying for 8, 9, 10 months, right? It's not possible to give so much of yourself to something and not be transformed by it, right? And so we need to create that space. And I think that's another thing that's missing, both in the birth world and the creative world, is more space for the after of birth, right? That postpartum period, that postpartum to the dissertation, the postpartum to birth, the postpartum to writing that book or publishing that article or whatever that is, right? I think we tend to have this sort of, in the moment, we'll have this quick celebration and then everyone moves on, right? And it's reminding me too of, there's this thing that we talk about in the academy of like, you go through this sort of depression after you finish your dissertation or you've like completed your PhD because you've given so much of yourself to something. There's a celebration at first, but then there's a sort of kind of like silence when no one's around and you kind of feel lost. Like, okay, well, what next?
Well, yeah, there's so much momentum and intensity, adrenaline that, we have to summon to reach this goal. And if you pay attention, you're addicted to that high level of anxiety, and it's hard to step off the treadmill. You don't know how. I took that energy with me into my professional life. It was incredibly self-destructive, and I couldn't stop panicking about everything. It became a kind of masochistic way of working. No one tells you that you can stop, that you must, because it's just not sustainable. It is not a healthy way of living or working.
Well, they don't tell you that because they want you to be in that state, right? Let's look at the fact that you finished the PhD and you're thinking, oh, I've arrived, right? But let's say you're going for a tenure track job. Well, if you're in a tenure track job, you're in the same process you were in when you were a PhD student. You got hoops you got to get through. You got to write certain articles. You have to have whether it's a book published, you have to have, notoriety from certain people. It's the same process. It's the same it's the same process, right? You're just starting all over again. So that's why they don't tell you, right? Because they want you to be in that state, which also causes a kind of like amnesia. Like, oh, it's all normal. Let's just keep moving.
Yes, it also reinforces that separation that you were talking about earlier, not only between the mind and body, but it causes us to isolate and to buy into that belief that we are always in competition.
Always. Always. Right? And so the postpartum demands that we stop and reflect. Right? It demands that we pause and be present, whether it's grief, whether it's sadness, right? So many birthing people go through a period of grief after giving birth. Why is that? You birthed something into the world. Your whole body, your emotions are thrown off. It's not just hormonal. right? You have to kind of refigure out, how am I situated in the world? And it's the same thing after you've published a dissertation or a book or done a major. It's like, how am I situated in the world? You need to sit and pause, right? So that you can be present in the body rather than say, oh, my body is just acting up, I'm just going to ignore it and I'm going to keep moving. No. Those emotions are there to teach you, so that you can allow that moment that feels like a heavy grief, because you're like, why am I grieving? You're grieving because this is just a part of the process, right? It's that part of that renewal, right? Death is always a part of birth. We cannot avoid that, right? Anytime something is born, something dies. Anytime something dies, something is born. So there's grief that you have to go through in that transition.
You spoke earlier that about these rituals, and that it is creating these spaces that allows us to pause and integrate the transitions in our lives. Can you speak to those practices that have helped you to process and live into your transformation, to grieve in a healthy way, for instance?
Yeah, very much so. I'm in the Vodun tradition, but I think in many ways of what I connect to is has resonances in a lot of Africana traditions where, one, it's really important to create space for death, right? And space for death is kind of always present, and not always in a necessarily negative way, right? For instance, like there's an understanding of your ancestors, those who have passed and who were respected elders in the community, right? So not everybody who dies is an ancestor. Let's make that clear. Okay. So those who would have been respectful and respected members of the community who passed and who are part of your lineage, right? Those are your ancestors, and they're always with you. They're always guiding you. They're part of your warriors, right? Alongside your deities, whether you call those your Vodun, your Orisha, right? Or your Loa, right? Depending on what tradition we're speaking about, right? There's an understanding of a community of beings that are around you, that are supporting you through the transition. There's also an understanding that, bad things do happen. The goal is to find balance, right? The goal in life is to find balance. There's an understanding that, yes, like evil, bad, negativity exists in the world, right? Our goal is to find balance. And how we find that balance is often by taking those moments to rest and respect. We have to take moments to respect the dead, right? So every year, for instance, in my tradition, in early January, there's a major ritual that is done to make offerings to your ancestors, right? Because you also are here. They're there to help you, but you're also there to help them. You have some who have died, who have not died peacefully, right? It's also your responsibility to take care of those who have not died in a way that allows them to transition peacefully, because that affects you as well, right? It's a whole communal circle, right? And so I think that the thing that my tradition really teaches me is to really sit with death, right? To really sit with death and understand death is always a transition that allows for birth, that allows for new life. And the thing that's coming to my mind right now, where I've really learned this on a personal level, is before I got pregnant this time, I actually experienced several miscarriages. So my husband and I knew we wanted to have a child this third time, and had been trying for about a year. And unlike the first two times, I did not get pregnant right away, and I had at least two, I would say three miscarriages, and that was one of the hardest things I've had to go through, because it's the realization that life and death are so intimately connected, right? Um, Even though that experience was hard, I'm also thankful for that experience because it helped me to understand how precious life is, right? And how precious the birth experience is, but also helps me to give space for death, right? And I think that's something we don't give enough space to, right? There's not much conversation about miscarriage, and not just miscarriage of a baby, but what about the dissertation that wasn't finished or the article you didn't publish, right? What happens? Where is there space to kind of deal with that loss, right? So that we can turn that loss into new life, an opportunity for life again. And I think so it's I get a lot out of my tradition in terms of really understanding this intimacy between death and life and how important it is to honor death in order to bring more life, more abundance into the world, right? By trying to avoid death, we actually create more of it.
Well, and this is directly related to what we're experiencing in the world today, right? With the ongoing fatigue, the loss of loved ones and identity, ways of life. So many folks are struggling, and the global pause has allowed, but also forced us to sit with this in this space of grief. While the pause is good, still there's a lot of resistance.
There's a lot of resistance. I mean, for months and months now, 1,000 people have been dying a day in the US for months. For months, right? We're going through months and months of death and disease. And that's hard to sit with. I've been having this conversation with a couple of people, right, around the pandemic and how different people are reacting to it. And I think one of the things I have learned to have some compassion for people who don't seem to be taking it seriously is it's really hard for them to sit with the death and the disease. We have not been trained to do that, right? To sit with the fact that people are dying. So it's easier to be in denial, or it's easier to not really think about, wow, 1,000 people died today, 2,000 people died today. You know, that's harder work to do. But in order to get through this, we have to sit with it. You know, we're in winter right now. Winter is a time of hibernation, right? This disease is telling us it is time to hibernate, right? In my tradition, disease is a vodun, right? It's telling us it's time to hibernate, to slow down. Not that social connection is not important, but there is a season for everything. And we need to slow down and take stock, or else we're just multiplying and creating a bigger situation than it needs to be.
And how do you help others hold space for grief and loss when they may recognize that they need to do this, but knowing you need something and being able to do it are two different things. So, how do we make space in our lives for the work that needs to be done?
I think because there's just not enough rituals around death in our communities, right? And at least in westernized societies, right? I mean, think about any instances around death. You look at miscarriage, you look at abortion, you look at what's going on with a pandemic. There is a sort of, you know, things that we don't want to see and really deal with, right? There's not a way to, we don't live in a culture that that has equipped us to sit with death, right? And that's something though that in indigenous traditions is inherent, right? When you have indigenous traditions where the foundation of the tradition is honoring the ancestors, you have to sit with death, right? How do we reconnect to our ancestors? How do we right the wrongs of some of those ancestors? Right? And how is that? So I don't think there are easy answers. Like I have people that I know that I love very much who don't take the pandemic very seriously. And I have had to learn to just create space to be present with them in the way that, they can be, and continue to be who I am and to be connected in the way I need to be. But we can't force anyone to do anything, because that's the other thing, right? For transformation to happen, it has to come from internally. In my tradition, there's an understanding of everyone having something called a say, and not just humans, animals, plants, everything has a say, right? This is kind of like your divine force, your destiny. It's sort of your inner guiding law, right? If something is going to happen in your life, then your say has to say yes to it, right? And so, like, I don't know what someone else's destiny, I don't know what someone else's say has decided for them. I don't know what destiny, what say they chose before they came here. So I can't make someone go through that process. They have to go through that process in their own time, in their own way. And that's hard too, right? That's also a kind of sitting that's hard.
I love what you said earlier, that life and death are so closely related, and you realize this on such a visceral level. How do you see that playing out today? There's a lot of death, but what do you see being born, Elana?
Hmm. Well, I think a lot is already being reborn. I mean, our world is shifting quite a bit. I mean, even if you look at how we work, is shifting. There's so much more of an attention now by even people who don't want to necessarily grapple with the pandemic to life, to actually living and not just working and being productive, right? So I think what's being born out of this is an attention to that our lives can be more than just work, right? That we no longer have to operate as machines, right? So, both if we're thinking about the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, there's this understanding of us operating as machines, of being productive, and that's also true for pregnant bodies. There's this understanding of like, oh, as a pregnant person, you are producing a baby, right? And so we're going to focus on the end product, which is the baby, right? Or as a person in Western society, you are a producer. So we're going to focus on what's your career, how much you make, what all of these things, these things that may not matter as much, or matter, but are not the whole picture, right? And so I think people are starting to step back and say, wait a second, I need to live. That, like, we're not going to just make work-life balance this cute little conversation. So maybe that means I need to leave my job entirely. Maybe that means I need to start a new business. Maybe that means I need to demand more from the companies that I work with or the organizations that I work with. And so I think there's a lot that's already being born.
Speaking of birth, you have some classes beginning this month, right?
Yeah, so I have been doing a lot of private hypnobirthing classes, which I love because I love working one-on-one with birthing people and their birthing partners. But I have decided to offer a group class coming up January 22nd. Knowing that I'm going to be pregnant, I'm like, I want to make sure I make this available to as many people as possible who might want it before my own pregnancy. And I thought it might be nice to have a community, like as I'm preparing for birth, like they're also preparing for birth. So I'm super excited about this upcoming course. And it's specifically for BIPOC birthing people and their support partners. And I did that because there is so... we see information all the time about Black women and women of color and the increased rates of mortality and infant mortality and how dangerous it is to give birth and all of the challenges of giving birth. And I wanted this first group to be kind of in honor of like creating a space for you to build your own inner power and know that, you can craft the birth you want. Doesn't mean that everything's going to happen the way you want it to exactly, but being, a space where BIPOC birthing people can build that self-confidence, to flow with pregnancy and to flow with birth together. And so that's kind of my goal.
I think it's beautiful to create these sacred communities, and your work is so important, especially because these are areas where conversation is needed. To have a group specifically focused on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, as you said, I know you also are very open to individuals in the LGBTQ plus communities.
Yes, very much so. Because I think it's really important for the queer community to have a space to also birth with confidence, right? And to birth, because even just the language around birth. Most books you will read will talk about women. Well, not all birthing people are women or identify as women, right?
And wait, there will be so many people who will experience cognitive dissonance around what you just said.
I know, but it's the fact, right? That to birth, you do not have to identify as a woman. You can, but you don't have to. You also don't have to identify as a mother.
Yes, there are so many misleading narratives around this experience of giving birth. For
Yeah.
example, another that comes to mind is age and the idea that at a certain age, birth is off the table.
Yeah, it's becoming more of a trend for more women to be giving birth in their 40s and even 50s. I think it is that is shifting, right? I feel like if you feel like this is your path, then you need to be supported in that. You need to be supported in that. Why? I mean, would anyone tell you not to write a book at 45?
Well, that's a great point.
So if you want to have a baby, go on and have a baby.
What is next for you, Elana? What do you see for you in 2022? How are you planning to create balance and flow in your own life?
I think one of the things I'm seeing is actually offering more group courses, and create. And one of the reasons I think I see that for myself in the work that I do is creating more community. Right. I spend a lot of time in a lot of Facebook groups around pregnancy, and I think they are and can be supportive environments. But I think there's also a lot there that reinforces sort of negative narratives around pregnancy and birth and parenthood.
Can you give me an example?
So, for instance, when there are conversations around, for instance, induction, right? Let's say someone was induced and someone else is asking about, about being, induced and and someone say, oh, well, I got induced at 38 weeks and my baby was fine and right? And so this sort of sends the message that induction is normal and everything will be fine, right? But induction is a intervention. It is a medical procedure. It is turning the birth experience that is natural into something that is being manipulated, right? And it doesn't mean that we should never, induction shouldn't exist, because I don't think that. But I think it sort of creates this sense of like, just like we try to control everything else, like we try to put everything on a schedule. Like, okay, I have this meeting at 5:00 on Monday, so I'm gonna have my baby on this particular date at this particular time, right? Which is like trying to put birth on a schedule, right? And so I think that, with an environment where there's more understanding that that's not how birth has to look, and it doesn't have to be a norm, I think is important. And it's very similar with breastfeeding, right? We have a bottle feeding culture. So even the fact that, like, if you go buy a little baby doll, right, at the store, they're probably gonna have a pacifier and they may have a little bottle, right? Because the assumption is how you feed your baby is from a bottle, right? And so there's these ways that we get these sort of little messages that say your body isn't working.
I was reading on your website that you're applying mindfulness techniques to breastfeeding. and that it's transformative in that experience for families.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to hypnobirthing. So hypnobirthing and mindful breastfeeding kind of are in very much the sort of same place. It comes from this place that our minds affect our bodies and our bodies affect our minds, right? And so if we want to have it to improve our experience with lactation, right? That our mind is important, where our mind is. How are we thinking about lactation? How are we thinking about how we want to feed our child? What are the worries and anxieties that might be getting in the way of us, of our lactation relationship with our child? Right? How are, so many people that I work with have, parents who will say, oh, well, you can give your baby a bottle, da, 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 da. They don't want to give their baby a bottle, but they're being pressured by other people to do so. Now, if you want to give your baby a bottle, give your baby a bottle. But I think it can be hard, specifically when it comes to lactation, when you're surrounded by a culture that's telling you you can't adequately feed your baby from your own body. And that's what you want to do, right? That's hard. And it's the same thing with birth. That's a birth that says, no, you can't adequately birth without a medical professional. Something is not right about your body. We have to be in control of the process, right? And so again, it's about sort of tapping into that flow. And once you tap into that flow, you may eventually realize, yes, for my own personal purposes, for what I need to do as a parent, I'm going to give my child a bottle, whether that means express milk or formula. But I want that to come from them and not from everyone else, right? And figuring out what's right for them and the kind of parent they want to be and what they want that relationship to look like.
It sounds like you've taken your own evolution, this coming into your own, and now you're offering a space for others to experience it for themselves.
Yeah, very much so. Because we all want to live, or at least I would hope that the goal is to live authentically, right? So we have to kind of be in touch with what's right for ourselves. What's right for one person isn't always right for the next person. It often isn't. We are unique. We are made unique. We are unique creations, right? And so giving honor to that, both in how we birth and in how we parent.
Elana, thank you so much for sharing your courageous spirit and your wisdom. The path you are walking and this trail you are blazing will help so many to have a transformative birth experience. I know that all those whose lives you touch will be blessed and enriched.
Thank you. That means so much to me. It hasn't been easy to walk this path. It's not easy to say, I'm just going to be me, regardless of what other people think. Just going to do me. That's not easy. And so I appreciate being celebrated, because there's also not a lot of spaces to be celebrated fully as who you really are. And so I appreciate that. And I appreciate you giving me this space to kind of share my journey. This has really been a blessing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elana. I hope you'll check in after you welcome your new baby into your family.
Yes, that'd be great. I love that.
And I look forward to hearing about the next version of you that emerges from this experience. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
If you would like to find out more about Dr. Elana Jefferson-Tatum or her group Hypnobirth course beginning January 22nd, go to LunarFlowDoula.com. That's LunarFlowDoula.com. LunarFlowDoula.com. You have been listening to InterSpace with Angelina Avedano. My heartfelt gratitude and appreciation goes to my husband, David Needs, Senior Production Engineer. If you would like to learn more about me or my work, look for me on Facebook and Instagram, Dr. A. Avedano with Cicada Personal Metamorphosis. That's Cicada with a Y, C-Y-C-A-D-A. Or you can email me at dr.aavedano@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This is Angelina reminding you that we're all connected.